Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Hello. I think I'm going to have some. I'll need some help from the back, I think. Could you? Hello?
It's coming.
Is it on? Is
Hello.
this on? Okay, great. Um, please move back to your seats. We have some time later for further conversation. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. We will now continue our program. And my name is Lisbeth Stier. I am a fellow at the Center for Universal Education here at Brookings, and I will be moderating this session. So our key question today, as we heard in our previous panel, is really how we are going to scale learning across the world. And as we discussed earlier, actually, this involves two things. The first is we need to get those children that are currently out of school into school, and there are about 57 million children at the basic level currently out of school. Secondly, we need to get those children that are in school to require the right skills. And estimates say that there are currently about 250 million children that are actually in school but not learning. We were already discussing this earlier. In this session, we will look at how governments can use their own resources to achieve these goals. And we all know that domestic public finance is by far the largest and most important source of finance for education. And over the last decade, resources through the public sector have increased dramatically in developing countries. Between 1990 and 2011, spending on education went up from around 3.1% of GDP to 4.1% of GDP. And that's a large number if you calculate the growth of those countries as well. And this is wonderful news. But increasing the level of spending is not the only challenge. A perhaps even bigger challenge is how you then actually go and allocate those resources to the children within the countries. And so, for a moment, imagine you're the Minister of Education or you're the Minister of Finance. How are you going to allocate your resources? We heard a lot of interesting kind of ways earlier, but if we look around the world at how governments do this, we basically find there's sort of three principles that guide allocations. One is finance can be allocated based on fairness. Every child gets an equal amount of money. It can be allocated based on need, even though we know that disadvantaged children will have much greater needs. And third, money can be allocated based on impact. So where is the biggest bang for your buck? Now, in school finance literature, actually, people refer to this as equity, adequacy, and effectiveness. Most countries have a combination of these different principles in the way they allocate. So governments will have to answer a number of questions with regards to this. On equity, they have to think about, do we allocate based on the number of students, or do we allocate based on the number of children, whether they're in school or out of school? On needs, to what extent do we allocate resources to disadvantaged groups? How much more do we give them? What's an adequate level to allocate to disadvantaged groups? On impact, what kind of programs are going to deliver the biggest results? And what kind of incentives can be built into the system to produce those results? There are lots of questions out there. Governments also have to think about, what do we do with donor money? How do we calculate that into the allocation? These are difficult questions, and all well-meaning educators and governments are trying to struggle with them. We know that in many countries, sadly, the current allocation mechanisms are not producing the results we need. In fact, they're producing the opposite. Things are getting worse. Inequities are being exacerbated by the way money is allocated. Wealthier children tend to receive a lot more public money than poorer ones. We've been working in Bangladesh and found that some districts receive 10 times as much public resources than other districts. How do we kind of put that all together, and how can we do better? So the question for us today is, what kind of financing models are needed to get those 57 million children into school and to get all children learning? And no one is better placed to help us with this question than Julia Gillard. Julia was already introduced earlier, but I wanted to highlight the role she played in spearheading reforms of the education financing system in Australia. During Julia's time as education minister, she commissioned a major assessment of Australia's financing system that formed the basis for the reforms. And as Prime Minister, she was also able to put these recommendations and reforms into practice. It's an incredible honor, Julia, to be working with you here at Brookings, and we are very thrilled to have you with us today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to Elizabeth for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be able to speak at this session. What I was intending to do on this ugly subject of money is describe to you the Australian reform experience and to try and draw some insights out of that which may be useful for other nations in other contexts. To do that, I just need to give you some very brief background on the Australian education system. Australia, obviously a vast landmass, teaching around 3.6 million students in 9,500 schools, schools in obviously urban settings but right through to outback locations. Our schooling system has both public and private components. Public education, state schools are predominantly financed by state governments, our 6 state and 2 territory governments. The federal government plays some role historically in their funding, but overwhelmingly financed by state governments. Then we have a private schooling system. The word private actually masks the fact that each of those schools also receives some public money, historically predominantly from the federal government, and then parents pay private contributions, fees, to have their children educated in those schools. When you look at the proportions overall, roughly about 2/3 of Australian students are educated in state government schools, 1/3 are educated in non-government schools. That does mask a little bit that in primary education, overwhelmingly children are going to state government schools, but by the time you are reaching the upper end of secondary education, people are often choosing the private alternative for the last few years of their child's education, and so the proportions are different at that stage. When we compare our education system with the standards of the world, Australia has a good education system if you're going to look at PISA or TIMS or any of those international measures. But when I became Education Minister, there were already some troubling signs coming out of those international testing regimes. First and foremost, we were starting to slip back in the rankings. Now, that wasn't an absolute decline in standards, but a relative decline in standards. Other nations were improving more quickly than Australia was. And then a persistent problem when we looked at ourselves in those international tests was that we had a long tail of disadvantage, that for a high-income country, 12th biggest economy in the world, we had too many children from poorer backgrounds, Indigenous children particularly, who were being left behind. So the gaps in education for those children, they could easily be 2 or 3 years behind Australian children generally in their achievement levels at school. So when I became Education Minister, I wanted to change this. And in order to change it, we really needed first and foremost to find out what was going on in Australian education. We had the international testing data, but we didn't have anything more finer grained which would tell us what was actually happening in schools. As I said a little bit earlier today, we had plenty of prejudices. We had advocates of public education who would say the problem is too much money goes to private schools, we're teaching the disadvantaged kids. If you just changed that, took some money off private schools and gave it to us, everything would be fixed. You had private schools who were saying, well, really, we're alleviating burdens from taxpayers because parents are putting money into their children's education because those kids come to our schools. So if you just had more private schools, everything would be fixed. And so the politics of education in Australia was really about contending sectors, public versus private. And as a result, about contending governments, because the federal government was overwhelmingly financing the private schools and state governments were overwhelmingly financing state schools. So the state governments would say, it's all the federal government's fault, you're putting too much money into private education. And the federal government would say, well, we fund schools that are doing well, why can't you state governments do the same? So lots of adults, private, public, state, federal, having a wonderful conversation amongst themselves. Meanwhile, of course, in the actual schools, there were too many children who weren't achieving the kind of learning outcomes that we wanted them to achieve. So the first thing that I did as Education Minister, and it was a very controversial call, is I said, let's not talk about school systems anymore, public or private. Let's actually get real-time data on what is happening in every school, public and private. So let's shift our gaze from the school sectors to individual schools and find out what's happening in each individual school. So we created a data set which ended up being publicly available through a website called My School. So I'd invite you, when you've got some time, to go on that website, anybody can, and you can look school by school in Australia about what is happening in those schools. What you will find on that website is, first and foremost, you will find national testing results. So on the same day, every year, kids across Australia in grades 3, 5, 7 and 9 do literacy and numeracy tests. And we will be adding to that with science testing as well. Then all of that data is made available, of course, to teachers. It's a well-designed test, so it gives diagnostic information about how children are going. It provides a report card to those children's parents so they can see how their kids are going too. But the information is also made transparently available school by school. So you can see how your school is going. Now, if that's all the website gave you, it wouldn't really be that useful, because you don't need a website, you don't even need national testing to tell you that in Australia it is very likely that the children who go to the most elite private schools are scoring well in literacy and numeracy. And unfortunately, it is also far too likely that Indigenous children going to outback schools are scoring badly. Now, it doesn't have to be like that. Those kids can all get great educations and get great results. But if you just had that testing, that's what it would tell you. Therefore, the website also gives you a series of measures about the level of advantage or disadvantage of children at that school. Those measures are generated against parental income, highest education level of the parents of the kids, the number of Indigenous children in the school, the number of non-English speaking children in the school, the number of children with disabilities in the school, and all of this is weighted to give one score, a particular score, which gives you a level of advantage or disadvantage. That means that we then had My School, so you could not only look at how an individual school is going in literacy and numeracy against Australian averages, You could also look at how that school is going against schools that teach similar students. So it started to be a tool to identify best practice and underperformance. If two schools teaching similar kids, one is getting great results, one's getting really bad results, then you can go into the great school and say, what are these guys doing right, so we can share it. You can go into the school that is underperforming and say, what do we need to do to lift up the performance of this school? But then that brought us to the ugly subject of money, because of course another variable that can impact on school performance is how many resources, how much money that school has available to it for the task of teaching the children. And so we added to my school, by school, breaking down and making transparently available the amount of money that school spends each year in educating children in that school. Now, that sounds easy to say. It was pretty hard to do. It was easy to do for independent schools, which weren't in school systems, because the dollars coming in from government, some from government, parental fees, spent in the school on the task of educating the kids, also spent on things like maintenance and payroll and professional development and all of the things that you need to do to run an entity like a school. For state government schools, those things like maintenance and payroll and professional development were actually paid for out of the state departments of education. So if you're going to end up comparing like with like, you needed to break down those head office costs and attribute them to schools as part of that school's amount of money that was going to educating the children. That in and of itself provoked a grand conversation when school principals for the first time in state schools could say, you're really telling me that the services I notionally get from the State Department of Education are worth this amount of money? You're really trying to tell me that? So there were some quite fevered conversations between school principals and State Departments of Education, which I think is all to the good, because central bureaucracy should be under pressure about the quality of the services and support that they're providing. So you then had on the one website results, the nature of the children in the school, the advantages and disadvantages they brought to school, and the amount of money being invested in their education. I wanted to get it to that stage because I always thought that if we had a data set where we could point to schools and say, these schools are teaching similar kids, the teachers are of similar quality, one is getting a bad result, one is getting a good result, and guess what? The school that's got the good result has got more money in it. What is that telling us, the adults? It's telling us that money makes a difference and we've really got an obligation to add more money to the school that is underperforming. And my school does give you the ability to do that. Even as we were building the website, we created a number of new funding streams and particularly worked in disadvantaged schools and tracked the changes so that we could forensically show that if you added more money with an appropriate change agenda, you could lift learning outcomes on literacy and numeracy sometimes by as much as 30%. So we ended up breaking down the funding conversation from being about contending school sectors to what do we need to do in individual schools. That enabled us to then have the information to make a long-term change to our funding model. Our funding model was opaque. There was no one in Australia sitting in a school who could really explain to you exactly how all of the funding was working, and it wasn't needs-based. So we asked an eminent group of Australians to provide us with a report on changing the funding model. And if my first insight is get a clear picture of what's going on to help drive change, my second insight would be often if you're going to get experts to advise, it pays to get people who are not necessarily immersed in the current system. So the experts we got were not people from education, they were leading business people, a range of experts who were coming to this with fresh eyes. And what they ended up doing was creating a number of reference schools, around 80 reference schools, schools that were teaching children that conform to the Australian average in terms of income profile, occupational profile of parents. They looked at those schools teaching average children, if I can use that terminology, that were getting good results, and they worked out what is the per capita spend that you need for a child that comes from an average background to ensure that child gets good schooling and good results at school. That became what we called the base of the school resource standard. So we said every school teaching children from average backgrounds should have that amount of money available to it. But to complete the school resource standard, it was then recommended to us, and we implemented, that there be loadings on top to recognise the factors that mean you need more effort to teach a child to a great standard. So on top of that, a loading for disadvantage, measured by a socio-economic index, parental occupation, income, a loading for children from non-English speaking backgrounds, a loading for Indigenous children, and a loading for students with disabilities. There was also changes in the school resource standard if you were in a small school, because obviously the fixed costs are amortised over a smaller student base, or in a remote school, because in remote Australia, just given the distances, everything costs more, including the salary rates necessary to pay teachers to have them teach in such locations. That is the school funding model that we are moving Australian education to, a school resource standard with these loadings. But it had to work across both the state school system and the private system. So in the private system, everybody, we wanted every child in the private system to have the benefit of the school resource standard, but there was built into the model an assessment of parental capacity to pay, an assessment of the income of the parents sending their kids to that school. Depending on where they were on the income gradient, the higher their income, the less public contribution there was. The lower their income, the higher public contribution there was. And there are schools in Australia that are non-government schools teaching very disadvantaged populations, and so they are getting a very high public contribution and the fees are very low. But even with that, we made sure for all schools, public and private, that the loadings, for example, the loading for disadvantage, was 100% publicly funded. So there is no reason for a non-government school to not enrol a disadvantaged student. They're not going to be there saying, well, if I start enrolling all these disadvantaged students, their education's going to cost more. I'm going to end up diverting money from the other kids to supplement the education of these children, because that supplement is coming from the government. Now, in Lisbeth's very elegant outline, what are the elements of that funding model? Well, the elements of it are a per capita consideration. We wanted every child, as part of their citizenship entitlement, to have some public resources directed towards their education. A needs-based model, so for children who we know have greater needs and will require greater investment to have a great education, that the system is responding to that through the loadings. And we also wanted it to be incredibly transparent, so that for any school in Australia at any time you could assess what money is going in and why it is going in, so that there were no special deals, no political arrangements that had been added on as a result of election promises or pledges, but complete transparency. Where are we in this journey? Well, the model is still in implementation. It has a 6-year phase in. There have been some consequences from the change of government, but the model will be phased in full in many parts of Australia. And I think whatever else happens in Australian education, we most certainly will not ever go back to a model that doesn't have at its base a school resource standard and loadings for disadvantage. So I think once you make the big shift, it is a shift that ends up being sustainable over time. People work in all sorts of different contexts. We obviously work in one where access is not an issue. We've got universal access. We're a country that, by world standards, has high income and the ability, therefore, to have large-scale expenditure on public services, including education. But I think that there are some things that are robust enough to come from our experience for other contexts. Transparency matters. Transparency helps drive change, and making sure that we correlate and can understand the intersections between learning, disadvantage and financing matter. What the ultimate financing model will be will vary enormously from place to place, but it needs to stack up in that correlation as something that is fair and will make a long-term difference for the education of students. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to participating in the panel. Thank you.